They'll tell you we're circling a star. Well, I'll take their word, I don't know. But I'm dizzy, so it may be so. I'm riding a big round ball. I never do dream I may fall. And even the high must lay low. But when I do fall, I'll be glad to go. Yeah, when I do fall, I will be glad to go. Yeah, when I do fall, I will be glad to
Edgar Casey has spoken about halls of records being in various places, left by the Atlanteans, who were absolutely a highly advanced technical society. It occurs to me that if we use computers with silicon chips to store data, and if the Hitachi Corporation with HP recently developed what they call super quartz. How many of you are familiar with the super quartz? Very recently, they've come up with quartz that can store data, forget this, hundreds of millions of years. Hundreds of millions, and this is not woo-woo, this is in all of the scientific journals. They're calling it the super fortress quartz. They say they have developed a memory chip with modified quartz that will outlast humanity. Now, if the Atlanteans were advanced, doesn't it make sense that they would have quartz computers, silicon dioxide computers to store data? That is what I think Max and Shauna Ra are. I think in years to come, we will learn how to project holographic images from them. But right now, the information comes through. They are living libraries. Sometimes when people touch them, they get an immediate sensation. Sometimes it might come through later, but there is absolutely a code activation, a transfer. And my information is that it is around the biocrystalline shift. Casey spoke about a new human body type emerging. I spoke about that yesterday. I think these crystal computers, which I believe are the only two genuine ancient crystal skulls, Max and Shauna Ra, are offering the bioshift, the codes of the bioshift. So that is my belief in terms of that. So if you do have the opportunity, take those sessions. And so today we have a really wonderful lineup of speakers, and we will have an astonishing array of masters. The first one will be Dr. Robert Schoch. Then we will have, throughout the day today, Dr. Charles Thomas Casey, a remarkable man, John Van Auken, director of the Association for Research and Enlightenment, Graham Hancock, just an astonishing array throughout the day of speakers. So Robert Schoch is someone that I've been wanting to get in contact with from a distance for a number of years. When I met him last year in Arizona, there was an immediate recognition. This is a brilliant man. This is a man who also carries great balance. There is no ego. There is a humility. There is an approachability that is the telltale mark of true masters, of walking masters. Metatron has told me that the new light workers will be the scientists. And this is a man that has revolutionized our understanding of ancient civilization. And with such a quiet, humble demeanor, he is really an enormous bright light. And it is not easy for academics to come through with new information that changes the old guard. Just like all of you as spiritual metaphysicians will face certain rejections by having different beliefs, academics that come up with new bits of information get that big attack from that collective thought form of the old guard. And we talked about that a lot yesterday. Some of Robert's astonishing discoveries, it took academia a long time to acknowledge them, and they only acknowledged them when there was absolutely no way they could not acknowledge them. And so it takes courage. It hurts when you get attacked. When you're in academia and someone says that what you've come up with is nonsense, that's a discrediting that hurts. This is a brilliant man, and he is doing a lot to reveal light into our history. I think he has it right. And a big round of applause for Dr. Robert Schoch. How about a standing ovation for this brilliant man?
Thank you very much for that introduction. It really is a pleasure to be here at Earthkeeper for a second time. So some of you have heard me speak a little bit before, but I hope you'll enjoy the journey. And if you hear a little bit of repetition, I hope that you get something more from it. But I've added new material also. So I'm always adding new material because I'm an academic, so this is ongoing research. It continues. We have to always, at least in my opinion, follow the evidence wherever it leads us. That is really my basic principle. And you'll see how even myself, sometimes I took wrong turns, but I think I've always tried to be honest and admit when maybe I was starting to go down one path, but it didn't quite work, so we go down another path as we follow the evidence. So today, I want to talk about really the fundamentals of my ongoing research for the last quarter century, and that is pushing back the origins of civilization. Specifically today, addressing my work on the Great Sphinx. Everyone's heard of the Great Sphinx. Yes. And also this new site of Göbekli Tepe, which confirms, I believe, so much of what I've been talking about for a very long time. So I am an academic, and as I was discussing actually with some people just before this presentation, in many ways I find that I straddle a couple of different worlds. I straddle the classic academic world. I received my PhD in geology and geophysics at Yale University. I have taught at Boston University as a tenured faculty member for decades now, yet I also come to conferences like this and speak. I mean that in the most positive way, but as James already alluded to, can you imagine how some of my academic colleagues feel if they hear, or what they think if they say, oh, I'm coming to a conference, Earthkeeper conference? And I don't want to sound the wrong way, but you have to acknowledge that these issues are real to this day, and I think this is something we need to break down and bridge the gap between the different communities. And I think that part of what a conference like this does is help accomplish that, help reach out. And I feel, honestly, comfortable in both camps, probably, I will say it bluntly, more comfortable here than the academic side in many ways, but I'm still in academia. So my serious studies of antiquity of civilization began about 1990 when I first went to Egypt. And I went there, and this is part of the paradigm. You've already, I think, heard about paradigm to a little small, some extent. There was a standard paradigm for the origins of civilization when I was an undergraduate, when I was a graduate student, and it is the paradigm that still is held by most academics and most, we'll call it common people, to this day. It's indoctrinated in them. And it was espoused and popularized, for instance, by the, and even though I don't disagree, even though I disagree with him on things, he's now deceased, that doesn't mean he wasn't a great anthropologist, a great archaeologist. He did a lot, but he was working in the late 19th, well, really 20th century, born in the late 19th century, V. Gordon Childe. And he really espoused and put together all the pieces of what became the standard paradigm of civilization. And that is that humans go through stages, sort of evolutionary stages, drawing on Darwin. You start out as savages, hunters, gatherers, remember those terms, and foragers, basically sort of scrounging for a living, not going to accomplish anything of sophistication. Then sort of the next stage is barbarism, and in a technical sense, a little bit of cultivation, agriculture, maybe some small villages, and then civilization, true civilization, which would include things like high culture. You would recognize it in the archaeological record from monumental architecture, sophisticated technology, literacy, cities, and this last stage, according to the dominant paradigm, was not reached, and the timing is important, not reached till about 4,000 to 3,000 BC, primarily in places like Mesopotamia, Egypt, maybe the Far East, later the Indus Valley, but it was a mere 5,000, at most 6,000 years ago. Of course, and all of you are aware of this, there's an alternative point of view that has been around for a very, very long time. Goes back to people like Plato, who talked about world ages, talked about sophisticated civilization going back to a much earlier stage. Plato, based on modern chronology, if you put Plato into modern chronology, when did he talk about sophisticated civilization? About 9600 BC. Remember that date, Atlantis. Who else talks about Atlantis, of course? One of the themes of this conference, Edgar Cayce. But academics, would they accept this? No, no. And when I was a young academic discussing things like this, what was one word I would never say publicly? Atlantis. I'm serious, because if you were, quote, searching for Atlantis or interested in Atlantis, you know, you didn't belong in academia. It was very much that attitude. The only way you study Atlantis was if you were a scholar of Plato or a scholar of classical Greece, and you just treated it as a totally nonsensical myth that maybe had some metaphorical value for, you know, studying politics, that type of thing. But the ancients were very serious about this. I have no doubt that Plato was serious about it. You have the ancient Egyptians, for instance. They talked about civilization, a cycle of civilization going back much earlier. They, for instance, used in modern translation the term zeptepi that referred to a first time or sort of a time of creation. They even talked about a beginning civilization, and one way to interpret it, what they say about it is that it's a time when the gods lived among humans. So earlier cycle, long before dynastic Egypt. So there is this background, but getting back to standard academia, the rise of civilization, this was a paradigm, 3500 BC. When I first got involved with the Sphinx in 1990, the classical date for it, which Egyptologists in many cases will still tell you, even though they're starting to have to deal with the evidence otherwise. But Egyptologists tend to be very, should I say, set in their ways? Yeah. But the classical date is 2500 BC. The standard chronology has problems, and the paradigm for me personally began to really crack in 1990 when I first went to the Sphinx. And some of you may have heard of him, John Anthony West. He's the one that introduced me to the issue of the Sphinx. This is John Anthony West on the left. That's a younger version of me from about 1990. So you'll see some younger pictures of me in some of these slides. And just to locate it, I know some people have been to Egypt because they've been there with me, but Sphinx is located on the Giza Plateau, eastern edge of the Sahara Desert. It's carved from the limestone bedrock. It is carved in situ, sits largely below ground level. Originally, only the head stuck up above the ground. That's an important point for us to consider later. It sits due east of the second pyramid, the so-called Khafra or Chevron pyramid, and it faces due east to the rising sun. So it's really quite spectacular. This is just a view showing the Sphinx. Can you see how to carve the body, they carved down below the bedrock? Only the head stuck up initially. This is an old aerial photograph, and you can see the Sphinx circled, and the Great Pyramid, second pyramid, a little portion of the third pyramid. But that is east, it sits due east. Also notice the Great Sphinx actually has 8 sides, but that's something for another discussion. In front of the Sphinx sits the Sphinx temple, and to build this, they carved enormous blocks out to carve the body of the Sphinx. They could have done it the easy way. They could have shoveled and picked and just made rubble and taken out bags of rubble or basketfuls of rubble. No, they actually carved huge multi-ton blocks, moved them in front of the Sphinx to build what's known as the Sphinx Temple. So that is effectively contemporaneous with the Great Sphinx. Do you see the ruins of the Sphinx Temple in front of it? In front of the Sphinx. Here's an aerial view, a person in scale there. Look at how large those blocks are. Here is just one block. That's John Anthony West and one of my students at the time, measuring it, the enormity of these blocks. Some of them are essentially the size of train cars, huge. We're not talking tons, we're talking tens of tons, maybe for the larger ones approaching 100 tons. And there it gives you another view of these huge limestone blocks. So this was a major, major construction, even if it had been 2500 BC and not much earlier, as I'll establish. How did they do this? What kind of technology were they using? So I'm a geologist. I've studied the weathering and erosion of the rock of the Sphinx. This is an aerial view. You'll see a few people down on the side there, just to give you a scale for the enormity of it, and to make very simple, to summarize, the core body of the Sphinx, not the head, we'll come back to the head, the core body, the walls of the Sphinx enclosure that were carved simultaneously show evidence of water erosion. The thing is, this is the edge of the Sahara Desert. It's been hyper-arid. We know this geologically for the last 5,000 years. So how do you have water erosion, and not just trivial water erosion, but major water erosion? Yes, some Egyptologists have said to me, oh, it still rains on the Giza Plateau. Yes, I have been there when it rains. But it doesn't rain to the extent and of the nature to get these types of erosional features. Even if you had a flash flood every 100 years, you wouldn't get this in the time frame we're talking about. This is just a diagram to show you how the water would run off and form not just this rounded, undulating profile, but the vertical fissures in it. The vertical fissures are actually very important. This is younger me. showing one of the vertical fissures. And I want to point out there's softer and harder layers of rock. There are softer and harder layers. You can see that the softer layers weather out a little bit more preferentially. Actually, the layer that I have my hand on is relatively softer than the higher layers. The higher layers recede back further because the brunt of the water running down was from the top. An important point is sometimes my critics will say, well, what you're looking at is water coming in from flooding Nile. Once in a while, the Nile flooding, and in the past, the Nile was much closer. No, if that were the case, you would have major undercutting. It would look very different geologically. So this is from water beating down above. This is just earlier this year in the same place. So I've aged, but maybe it looks the same behind. And here we're looking at these erosional features firsthand. And there we're looking at the different features and some additional perspectives. And this is sort of looking down. This is an older photograph. When I say older, when I took an earlier trip, there's a person for scale. This is the rump of the Sphinx. But I hope you can see the weathering features. It's very dramatic once you see it. I was speaking back in 1991 to a group of geologists about this annual meeting of the Geological Society of America, and several of the geologists said to me after the presentation, I mean, this is not complex geology. They weren't saying it in a nasty way, but you know, this is pretty straightforward textbook 101, Geology 101, geology. Where were the Egyptologists all this time? You know, but do Egyptologists study geology? No. And that's part of the problem. I'm not trying to badmouth the Egyptologists when it comes right down to it. What I'm saying is, do we need to bring different disciplines together and different ways of thinking together? So here we're looking at some of the features again, just a diagram to show how they were formed. And the younger me, here we see rain erosion compared to wind erosion, which is what you normally get in a desert like the Sahara. So that's a diagram showing it and how the softer layers are removed preferentially in both cases, but they show very different profiles. And that's the wind erosion. Just to give you a feel for that, that's younger me looking at wind erosion. And there is what I call sometimes a wind tunnel type structure. It is built up a little bit on the left-hand side so that it won't collapse. That's just modern concrete that's been put in their modern concrete block. But this is a huge wind tunnel feature, if you would. This is a tomb. And importantly, this tomb, according to the Egyptologists, is within a century or two of when the Sphinx, according to them, was constructed. Now, how do you get wind erosion like this and no rain erosion on this tomb and rain erosion on the Sphinx? And do you see this problem? It's a real problem. The only solution that has ever been offered, again, was a fellow geologist. And I will say up front, this is a joke, because he wasn't serious. And he said, don't you remember there was this cartoon? And I want to say Lil Abner, maybe? But anyway, he said there was this cartoon where someone always carried a black cloud over their head, and it rained on them, but no one else. Well, clearly, he said, that would explain why there's rain erosion on the Sphinx. So that was a joke. His point was it doesn't make sense geologically. Here you have a rain erosion, wind erosion. Some of the Egyptologists have tried to claim I'm comparing apples and oranges. So have you heard of Zahi Hawass? Zahi Hawass at one point, who was at the time in charge of all antiquities in Egypt, he got some Cairo University geologists to look at these rocks, and their job was to point out that Robert Schoch was incorrect. They were different rocks. They came back. They were honest enough to say, no, they're exactly the same thing. It's not hard to figure out geologically. No one ever heard from them again. Well, I mean, not that he got rid of them, but, you know, they no longer entered the debate. He didn't, if you have the wrong answer. Okay, so anyway, the point is, early on, it goes back to a much earlier period, had to go back, I said initially at least 5,000 to 7,000 BC, so at least a couple thousand years older. I've since revised that, and I'll get to that, because I think it's now even older. Just point out a few other things very, very quickly. And so, for instance, we have this erosional gully feature. Do you see that there? And it was filled in ancient times. So how do you get this gully feature? It's an erosional feature. It doesn't make sense according to the standard chronology. But if you look at a map here, this is an aerial view of the plateau. And what we had in ancient times is it sloped slightly this way. So water collected, and it ran down from a round up. This is the Great Pyramid, ran down, that's the Sphinx. It ran down, it poured over this back wall. Everyone follow me? Formed this gully here, and it all works, assuming that you actually have enough rain. So that would be pre-Sahara times number one. Number two, my Egyptological critics have pointed out, but they didn't point it out in favor of me, they just happened to have published this, that there is a major quarry here. This quarry was used to build the Great Pyramid. Now, according to them, which comes first? The Great Pyramid, the Sphinx was built much later, and geologically, once you quarry this, whether it was arid or not, it would stop the water runoff. Everyone follow? So this demonstrates, independent of other arguments, that the Sphinx has to be before the Great Pyramid, which is enough to throw any Egyptologist into a tizzy anyway. So there's just lots of different evidence like this. Here, getting back to it, as I said, the quarry would stop the flow of the water. The quarry that was used for the Great Pyramid. So lots of problems like that. And here's a picture. You can see, actually, the excavation. That's the excavation of that quarry. You can see it literally. To this day, it would just absorb the water and stop it from flowing over. Another, they call them geoarchaeologists. Do people know what geoarchaeologist is? It's someone who has some modicum of training in geology, and they work for an archaeologist. So their results should always agree with that of the person who they're working for, hires them, right? Okay. Now, I don't mean to be nasty, but where your money comes from, does that sometimes affect your results? Yes, I actually teach a course that discusses things like this, and it's been demonstrated. So one geoarchaeologist, he said, we can't deny the ancient weathering. Yes, Schoch is right. It is much older. The ancient aspects of the weathering are much older on the Sphinx, but that doesn't mean the Sphinx was carved by humans. What happened is that the Sphinx was this mound of rock, and this is an Egyptian geoarchaeologist. It was a mound of rock, and it was weathered by nature, wind, rain, very ancient times, and it started, lo and behold, started out as a lump of rock. It started to look like what? Sphinx, and then the Egyptians came and they sort of finished the job, touched it up, but they didn't do good enough job because, they still left a little bit of the ancient erosion there for Schoch to come and be misled. It's sort of like when the devil, misleads you by leaving things that... So anyway, this was if you're an Egyptologist, this was a very good theory. The problem is, remember what I said about the Sphinx? When they carved the body of the Sphinx, huge blocks were carved out to free the body of the Sphinx and move to the front to build the Sphinx and Valley Temple. And I have researched this to a great extent, and I have not found another documented case where wind and rain carve out blocks, move them, and construct a temple. I mean, maybe it's a first, but in every other case, it's involved humans. So I think maybe the Sphinx was carved by humans too, or someone. Other lines of evidence are things like the repairs. I just put this in because I like it. You see the picture on the left? That's me standing on the back of the Sphinx at the back of the head. So I've actually had the chance to walk around on the Sphinx, but it's been heavily repaired. And Dr. Zai Hawass, who I mentioned earlier, he pointed out to me that some of these repairs, my hand is on a very modern repair, in this case, a 20th century repair. This picture was taken in the late 1990s. And he said, oh, some of these repairs go back to Old Kingdom times. And I said, well, how can that be if it was built in Old Kingdom times? His answer was, it was rotten rock. I didn't find that particularly compelling. I think as a geologist, it's not such rotten rock. It's pretty good rock. And when you have a 3 feet or a meter worth of erosion and repairs, what that indicates to you is it's been around a long time and it's weathered for a very long time, especially given that this, in the last 5,000 years, it's been Sahara conditions, which tends to preserve, quote, rotten rock like this. So it's another line of evidence that I believe the repairs, and these very ancient repairs, you see some of them here on the back of it. Some of them are Greco-Roman repairs, some are modern repairs, but some of them are quite ancient. And in modern repairs, they're still repairing it to this day. They have a different attitude than we do about certain other things. For instance, if we had, I don't know, if the Mona Lisa, or no, what's another Da Vinci one? The Last Supper? Yeah, I mean, if you took the attitude that certain people take to the Sphinx, you just repaint everything on the Last Supper. Because, you know, it's a little faded and cracked. The problem is, when you repair it, does it cover up essential features? Yes, that are important to me geologically. Tying in with the repairs, the head. One of the first things I notice is that the head, in my assessment, is too small for the body. Do people see that? It's out of proportion. Why? Because I believe that this is not the original head. The head was heavily weathered and eroded also. Rather than repair it, as they did to parts of the lower body and tail, I believe that the head was simply recarved. Possibly it was a human head. I suspect actually it was a lion originally. Whether a male or female is another matter, but I suspect it was a lion. And just a few slides to show that the Sphinx itself was buried for thousands of years. This is important too because thousands of years of burial in the sand, would that erode it? Yes or no? No, it would preserve it. So it actually gets worse from an Egyptological point of view because it was being preserved. So when they tell me, oh, it's eroded for the last 5,000 years, no, it wasn't. It wasn't the right nature of climate to erode it and see what we see. And in fact, it wasn't the case at all. It's been documented for thousands of years that it fills up with sand, it gets covered up. These are 19th century photos to demonstrate that. And you have to clear it out on a regular basis. The ancient Egyptians from New Kingdom times, say 12, 13, 14, 1500 BC, talk about this. The Old Kingdom Egyptians apparently had to clear it out. This is from the early 17th century. All they saw at the time was a head, not a sphinx with a body. So it continues. I wanted more data, though. Before I would go out on an academic limb about how old the Sphinx could be, I wanted more data than just surface weathering and the other types of features that we've been talking about so far. I wanted to have subsurface data, so we did seismic tests. In the middle here sitting is Dr. Thomas DeBecke, who I collaborated with on this. And essentially, we took a sledgehammer, because that's all they would allow us to do. They wouldn't let us use explosives. You can understand why. That's how you actually get the finest results. But things have always been a little iffy, and they're uptight about certain things, like setting off what they could see as bombs. But we would use a sledgehammer. You basically put sound waves or energy waves into the rock. It comes back. That's Thomas DeBecky and John Anthony West. It comes back. It refracts and reflects. You've heard about that in crystals on a small scale. You've heard about that maybe on a planetary basis. So we were using the same types of techniques here to look what was underneath. And it confirmed, because I could then calibrate how fast or how deep the subsurface weathering was. I could calibrate that to known sites that we did for Old Kingdom structures, and it also pointed that went back to this remote period. Even more interestingly, or part of it, is that it wasn't carved as one structure, as one piece. There were a couple of different stages. This is something I had been speculating about based on the surface data, and I'm not going to go into great detail here, but basically the subsurface weathering is uneven around the Sphinx. This is just to show some of the raw data, which I don't expect you to process right now. But when you look at it, interpret it, essentially along the sides and front, it's much deeper subsurface than in the back, where it's much more shallow, which suggests, doesn't just suggest, it indicates pretty evidentially that the rear of the Sphinx, where I'm showing it here in red, it was not carved all the way down initially. So essentially the Sphinx emerged from the bedrock. Am I making sense to everyone? This wall was carved originally where you see the heavy weathering, the rain weathering, but it's sort of plateaued out at the level where there's a couple of people walking there, and the Sphinx emerged from the bedrock. And I didn't know, why would they do this? It didn't make sense at the time necessarily. Show you why, I think, in a second. This is just, it was a little bit of a sandstorm when we took this photograph, my wife, Catherine Ulysses, and I. But you can see the original wall here, and then you can see how the secondary wall, which was carved in Old Kingdom times, about 2500 BC, when they were refurbishing the Sphinx, taking an older structure and reusing it, you can see maybe how in this photograph, it's actually not as well done. They're doing a cruder job. So initially, the Sphinx actually emerged from the bedrock. It was connected at the rump area in the west to the actual bedrock, and then in Old Kingdom times, it was carved out completely. Why might it have been originally carved to emerge from the bedrock? Well, very long time ago, say 11,000 or more years ago, in that time period, it was, people know precessional ages. I'm sure most of you are familiar with that. The age of Leo. What is the Sphinx potentially? Before it was recarved with the human head, it may have been a lion's head. Age of Leo, you had this structure, I believe, looking out on the vernal equinox at itself in the sky. Everyone follow? And not only that, from its perspective, Leo would have been rising from the horizon in this manner. Do you see how the rump would sort of be connected? So maybe this was symbolic. I just throw that out as something to think about. But it also ties in with that this is a structure, this is something that goes back much earlier. Other things, this is a map of some of our seismic work. Can you see the outline of the body of the Sphinx? These are the two paws, and we found this anomaly under the left paw, and this ties right in with, of course, the great Edgar Cayce, because he, what was his interest? He had certainly interest in Egypt, and he tied it in with Atlantis and among other things, as I understand. I'm not a specialist on this, but he suggested that there, decades earlier, I mean, before I was born, that there would be found near or under the paws of the Sphinx one of the halls of records. And we found this, Thomas DeBecke and I, seismically. There's definitely a chamber under the paw of the Sphinx. And there's no doubt it's there. Some people have tried to deny it, like Zahi Hawass. But I don't want to sound the wrong way, but the more he denies something, the more you can be sure what? That's there, yes. Yes. It's there. And I can talk about that more if you want. If you want to talk to me privately. How did you get into it? That's one thing that people have argued about. Some people say, well, maybe there's a passage behind this stela that's between the paws of the Sphinx. I actually don't think so, because I think we would have picked that up seismically. This is the so-called Thutmosis dream stela between the paws of the Sphinx. Can you see there how it's got the images of sphinxes on it? And there you can see a little bit more. Interestingly, when we did the seismic work, among other things, where it's just sand and whatnot in front of the Sphinx, and this is the Valley Temple and Sphinx Temple, we did seismic lines here. What we found is that under the sand, there's actually this huge cliff face under the sand. Now, if you look at something like the image from the Sphinx stela, what do you have? You have the Sphinx. It's sitting, looks like it's sitting on top of the temple. Everyone see that? Yeah. I suspect that at one point you would approach it from this direction. You would look up at a cliff. You would see the Sphinx temple, and you would see the Sphinx looming above the temple from that perspective. Everyone follow? And I suspect that the chambers under the paw of the Sphinx, maybe the entrance is somewhere in that cliff face, which is now under meters and meters of sand. So one project I'd like to do is to get in there and start exploring that. Now, no, I'm serious. We need to do this. Because what could be in that chamber? We don't know, and it could be very important. We found that, yes, there is something in it. It's not empty. You could tell by the ringing, if you would, the resonance of the chamber. But since then, the Egyptian authorities, certainly under Zahi Hawass in the past, have not been, should we say, super cooperative. So one more project. So my original timeline, pushing back the age of the Sphinx, and I have pushed it back to this period initially, just to orient you, because I'll talk about the end of the last ice age later. The beginning of traditional civilization was here. Do you think this helped me academically? No. If I had not been tenured, I wouldn't have been tenured. Yes, I wouldn't have a job. So I wasn't stupid. I made sure before I start talking about this, I was tenured. No, this is the practicalities of things, because it really upset a lot of people, especially Egyptologists, archaeologists, historians. It upset them more when things like a documentary was made about the mystery of the Sphinx, hosted by Charlton Heston. Everyone knows why Charlton Heston? Because he was Moses. Yeah, so he was a good person to talk about it. And he got into it. You can still get this. I do want to say that it's been re-edited and supplemented, and there's stuff in it that I'm not fond of. But when it first aired on NBC, it won an Emmy for Best Scientific Research, which only meant that the research in the eyes of academia went further down, because, if something's popular, it can't be right. And it had these headlines: scientists say new view of Sphinx could rewrite history. I thought that was a little over the top, maybe, but certainly pushing things back. Debate rages over the Sphinx's age. I once said this, I didn't mean it as a joke. Scientists clashed on age of Sphinx, Egyptian Sphinx, and I hope it was it Last Earthkeeper? It was somewhere I made the comment that I actually never understood this headline until I realized that they were considering Egyptologists to be scientists. Because the geologists all agreed with me, who are scientists, and the Egyptologists were really the historians were the ones that didn't agree. And I'm not trying to badmouth, but the point is, are we talking different disciplines? Yes, yes. And it made editorial cartoons, that type of thing. It came to a real head, and the date is important here because this was very early on, 1992. People were so worked up about it in some circles that a special debate was called for the American Association for the Advancement of Science annual meeting in 1992, where it was going to be debated the whole issue of the age of the Sphinx. And I thought this was a true debate. I was invited to it. Thomas DeBecke was invited to it. This is from back then. This is myself and Thomas DeBecke. You probably can't tell. This is Mark Lehner, Egyptologist, who had been with the Edgar Cayce Foundation, had been with the ARE and then broke with them, if any of you know that history, and now was the person to stand for the status quo, to defend the status quo. I was his worst nightmare in some ways. And this is a guy named K. Lau Gowrie, who's not real important for our argument now, except that he was a geoarchaeologist, so he did what he was paid to do. And I thought it was going to be a real debate where we were going to talk about data. Turns out it was meant to be, let's put Robert Schoch in his place so we'll never hear from him again. And I mean that in all honesty. And the biggest argument that Egyptologist Mark Lehner had was, and this is a direct quote published in the New York Times at the time, if the Sphinx was built by an earlier culture, where's the evidence of that civilization? Where are the pottery shards? I know. Egyptologists and archaeologists, if you don't have broken pottery, you might as well not have anything. During that age, people during that age were hunters, and remember the paradigm I told you about? The paradigm came before all else. He knew, Mark Lehner and all his colleagues knew, that if you're talking 5,000, 7,000 or more BC, people were hunter-gatherers. This was impossible. You didn't even need to think about it further. I was a stupid, naive geologist who did not understand history. Making sense? Yeah, I mean, you don't even need to look at evidence because you know the answer. It just can't be. They didn't build cities, and he realized that something like the Sphinx and the Sphinx Temple implied major monumental these are major monumental structures. These would be people who would be civilized, building cities. So I didn't know what to make of it. This is young me back then, sort of disgusted. I mean, I knew the science was good, and I knew that there must be something else. And the analogy I sometimes use is, well, you find the first dinosaur bone, and people say it can't be. It's nonsense. It's just planted there by the devil or whatever. And but now, look, we've got all kinds of dinosaurs, but you had to discover the first one. You had to go looking for them. So that was 1992. Years later, enter Klaus Schmidt. He's now deceased. German Archaeological Institute. It turned out that since 1995, so that he didn't even start till 3 years later after that infamous debate, he started excavating this site known as Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey, which, I'll put it bluntly, vindicates what I was saying. This is independent supporting evidence, caught my attention certainly right away when I learned about it, because he talked about major building phases 10,000 to 8,000 BC, as old or even older than what I had been talking about for the Sphinx. And well before civilization is supposed to occur, here is where Göbekli Tepe occurs. Here, of course, is the Sphinx down here, and outside of Cairo. Göbekli Tepe is outside of the city of Urfa, which has all kinds of biblical connections. Supposedly Abraham lived there. You can still see the pools of Abraham, which are revered by the Abrahamic traditions, Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. But Göbekli Tepe itself, it's this incredible site, and looking at our little timeline, I'd been pushing the Sphinx back at least this period. Klaus Schmidt independently had evidence that Göbekli Tepe was as old or older. And just to give you an overview of it, it consists of these stone circles. Do you see the stone circles there? And there's 20 or more megalithic stone circles to this day, and I'll be back there in a couple of weeks. To this day, major portions of 4 of them and then parts of others have been excavated. A number have been identified geophysically using various ground penetrating radar, that type of thing. So it's a really huge site. And we were there. This is John Anthony West. He went with Katie and myself in 2010 to take a look at. Katie and I have been there a number of times since. There's Katie, who is, many of you know her, she's here, and myself. And it's changed over the time, too. I just want to mention that. So this is 2012, where they were building around it. And in part, it is close to the Syrian border, and it was underground. I mean, it was covered over for 10,000 years, since 8,000 BC. We'll come back to that. It was covered purposefully in 8,000 BC. And since then, unfortunately, they have been crating them up and putting blocks in. So it's a very active archaeological site. And they're actually building over it to, I guess, try to protect it. But overall, it's a really stunning site. I mean, it's just incredible. If this had been found, and I've talked to a number of archaeologists and others about this, if you found parts of this in isolation, say one of the pillars, that type of thing, the level of sophistication, they said, well, maybe it would look like 1000 BC. Well within the time frame of civilization. The fact is, it goes back to the 10,000 BC range. And here you can see that the pillars are carved. So a lot of times people compare it to Stonehenge, but everyone knows Stonehenge has a visual image of Stonehenge. Those are really rough-hewn pillars. These are beautifully carved, and they have images on them. They have what look like animals on them, carved on them. Well, yeah, you could call them animals. I want to say right now, do I think they're simply representations of animals? No. I think there's something much more sophisticated going on here. They're probably cosmological, whether it's constellations, whether it's representing principles. Everyone follow what I'm saying? It's a classic thing. John Anthony West once said this to me, but it's certainly not original to him. If you read the Bible and you read parables of Jesus, that type of thing, and he talks about sowing and, harvesting and, you get what you reap what you, how's it go? So reap what you sow. He's not giving agricultural advice. He's talking at a much more sophisticated level. I think the same thing here. We can't just see these as pretty decorations, which do a lot of standard archaeologists see it that way? Yeah. And sometimes they call it, it's the world's first temple. Well, what do you call something when you don't know what it is? You either call it a temple or a tomb. No, I know my archaeology. Yeah, I actually, just to be clear, I do have formal training in archaeology. But anyway, so you have these beautiful pillars, and my point being, this is in the round. It's sometimes considered a little feline type thing. It's not stuck onto the pillar. It actually is part of it, so they had to plan to have it there, to carve it there. And I suspect, and I'm writing about this, I'm working on a book now about it, and I'm not going to try to get into what is all the sophisticated meaning of this symbolism, but I don't think it's just a bunch of little animals. It's really quite sophisticated. Another one, just to give you a feel for it, I'm just going to run through some pictures quickly because we've got more things to do. And I am paying attention at a time, so more, and as I said, it's an active archaeological site. I'm going to refrain from commenting on every slide. But it's really quite fascinating. Aren't they cute? Even if they're representing, profound principles or maybe scientific knowledge, if I could use that term, they're also quite beautiful. And beauty, there's if you interpret it at the most superficial level, a very happy fox, and as secondarily, do you see the little pig-like? Yeah, which is probably secondarily. When you start looking at these, they were being carved and different things were added at different times. So this was something that was being used and reused. That's actually part of one of the points I want to make to this day. Some people call that snakes. It's probably not snakes. It might be actually electrical or plasma type discharges. Something that you've already heard about yesterday is how CMEs and the sun can affect us at many different levels. I think this ties in with what is being represented at Göbekli Tepe. That is, in fact, one of the themes. You might think of this not as a temple or a tomb, but I think of it sort of as the equivalent of a library and a university. They were recording and teaching and learning and discovering things here in very ancient times. Just flip through some more. Aren't they incredible? And various pillars. Notice that, I'll get to this in a second, these are arms. Some of them are anthropomorphic. And this one, that's the same one from a different view. Very cute at the bottom. You see they look like little ducks. But that's the base. That base, I'll go back a second, that base is carved into bedrock. This pillar, do you see how shallow it's set into the bedrock? And I believe, and I can't get into why right now, that these were freestanding structures initially. These pillars, they may have been roofed over later because it was used in different stages, but you might think of it as a huge, what vibrates? Like a tuning fork. And that may have something to do with it too. I think they were very much into resonance and tuning, maybe for healing purposes, that type of thing. So a lot of sophisticated things going on at this very, very ancient site, which I think if they were here now or you were back then, there'd probably be a certain comfort level. Am I making sense? Yeah, that they were interested in things that this crowd is interested in versus maybe some of the academics who just dismiss it all as, a bunch of primitive religious nonsense. It's always been very interesting to me that a lot of academics, say Egyptologists, they devote their life to studying some ancient culture, but also it seems they devote their life to putting it down and saying how primitive it is, rather than trying to figure out the real sophistication of it. But look how shallow this is set in there. When they first were excavating this, they thought that at least a third of it would be set into the bedrock, not literally just centimeters. Also, if you've read anything about this and you've heard anything about the Cygnus theory, a lot of it is based on this little hole in the back, which is secondary, and I won't get into it now, but I just don't buy the so-called Cygnus theory that some people have thrown out for Göbekli Tepe. If you've never heard about it, don't worry about it. There's a lot of stuff that goes on, gets put out there. This is the late Klaus Schmidt. Unfortunately, he died recently, but the excavation, the work carries on. Here, he and I, a couple of years ago, were discussing on-site the dating, because something that was very important to me, I was heavily attacked for my redating of the Sphinx, and I wasn't just going to go and accept someone else's dating, even though it confirmed, I thought, helped support what I've been saying all along. What if they're wrong? Do you see my point? I wasn't just going to jump in bandwagon on something just because it confirmed what I wanted to hear. I really wanted to go and find out for myself, was this real? Was this genuine? Was it legitimate? And the bottom line is yes. It's an incredible site. Just a few fun facts about it. These pillars, the largest one, are 10 to 15 tons. We're talking, 5 meters, 18 feet or so in some cases. The central ones, you can see it here. Do you see it has arms and hands and a belt? You see that? They're really incredible. He believed, Dr. Schmidt, that they were sort of set in almost like a little concrete at the bottom, but they're so shallowly set, so shallow. It's really straight. What's important for the dating is the entire site was covered purposefully by 8,000 BC. So we're talking 10,000 years ago, like a time capsule. I'm not saying they did this as a time capsule, but who knows. It was purposefully covered. It was not a site that was abandoned. It was not left to the wind and rain, as most archaeological sites were. It was not, it was purposefully covered. And I was convinced on site when I looked at the evidence that, yes, you could see how they basically put in buckets and buckets of material to cover it over and spread it out, cover it over. Once that was done, it still rains there. You have mineralogical circulation. You'd have water running down. Everyone, have people been in caves, or you know the concept of stalactites and stalagmites? Basically, you form those on a micro level in the sediments once it was covered, and on some of the walls and whatnot. Once it was covered, those can be dated, and it confirms that everything was sealed up by 10,000 years ago. Everyone follow? So it's a really, really good control, and there's other stratigraphic control on it. And so, yes, this is a real thing. Also, not to be... not to look at, how do I want to say it? Well, let me put it this way, German. What does that mean? You think of Mercedes or whatnot. German Archaeological Institute, are they probably pre-meticulous? Yeah, and, they're no-nonsense types. So they are very accurate, very methodical, very careful. So this is not something that's just being pulled out of a hat. Notice the long, thin arms and the loincloth. They're really quite incredible structures. Okay. So then there's just a few more pictures. I want to make a few other points, and then we'll move on. Oh, further signs of sophistication. This is my own work. This is my own interpretation now. But this is a map put together by Klaus Schmidt and one of his colleagues, Joris Peters. And this is a picture Katie took of the site, just to orient you. Now, this is the map turned so that north is to the top. And what you see here are the various enclosures. Do you see that? So these are the pillars. These blue things are the pillars. These are actually secondary walls that I'll come to in green. Do you see how it forms ring-like structures? As a side note, what famous ancient city that scholars dismiss had ring-like structures? Atlantis. Just an interesting tidbit. Of course, I'm not making any connection whatsoever. And you'll notice that the central pillars are oriented. They're oriented toward the south, I believe. And notice how the orientation is sort of the same, south and slightly east. But do you see how it changes a little bit? Okay, what I believe they were doing, and I hit upon this, and I was almost embarrassed when I hit upon it. Well, because other people, I wasn't trying to repeat other people's work that they've done other places, but it looks like, I'm convinced, they're oriented toward the area of the Pleiades, Taurus, and Orion. Were those very important in ancient times? And they were oriented that way, but the thing is, do those change their position in the sky? Because of precession. And what I believe, on other independent bases, it seems this is the older one, oldest one, the next oldest, etc., and that they were reorienting this over a time frame of 10,000 to 8,500 BC, which spans the end of the last ice age. 10,000 BC is before the end of the last ice age, and 8,000 something is after. So we actually have a site that spans the end of the last ice age, which is very, very important. If they're looking out, this is just a diagram. Everyone knows Taurus, Pleiades, Orion, etc. Sometimes the Bible, aren't there famous Bible quotes about how God lives in the Pleiades? Yeah. So, but it does seem to go back. When I first got in this business, more or less an academic, a lot of my academic colleagues said, oh, this is absolute nonsense because the constellations, as we know them, only go back a couple of thousand years. We now realize that's not the case. In particular, Orion and Taurus area, there's independent evidence that they go back 15,000 BC to maybe 30,000 or more BC. So these are really ancient. I mean, the continuity here of cultural attributes is absolutely incredible. Just to give you a sense of what they would have been seeing, rising on the horizon, looking sort of south and slightly east. And again, this doesn't fit Cygnus, which is back in the other direction, but I'm not going to get into that now. And this pillar, remember I pointed out the arms and belt and loincloth? It may well represent Orion in the sky with the arms brought down and the torso. Orion, if you look at the actual constellation, lacks a what? Head. This lacks a head. It sort of has a block, if you would, that could represent the head. If they wanted to carve a head, could they have carved a head? Yes. They weren't. It's not because they were incapable. They could have carved a head if they wanted to. And you've got them coming down, and you've got them all together. And I wanted to make one point here, that you have this Orion orientation, and also Orion is often called the headless hunter and surrounded by the zodiac. And the zodiac is literally a ring of what? Animals. So isn't that what we have at Göbekli Tepe? So I think this is all tying in. And Orion also, with his belt stars, he travels with his companion dog. And do you remember what was under the arm? There it is again. Looks like a little dog. Yeah, so I think there are a lot of connections here, and I can only touch on a few at the moment. But excavations continue at Göbekli Tepe. I'm very excited to get there in a couple of weeks. If you'd like to join me, there's still opportunity, actually. I'm serious. Yeah. If you don't have any plans for late second half of June, you come. Excavations continue, and they do it the good old-fashioned way. I want to point out really briefly, they find little stuff like this. What's that? Yeah, what do you call it? Arrowhead, like an arrowhead or something. And this makes archaeologists feel good because does it look pretty primitive? Yeah. Well, guess what? I actually have seen people even here, I think, and I had students that still write with old-fashioned what? Paper. They write on paper and they use pencils or old pens. And isn't that primitive when we have computers? Do you see my point? But then you get something like this. Well, does that look very impressive? Yes, if you're looking at it and you know what you're looking at, this is a little bead, and they find them all over the place there, and it is drilled through with perfection. This just happened to be found when we were there on one trip, and so, we find these all over the place. And they're drilled through with the most precise, how were they doing this if this was Stone Age, hunter-gatherers? They're not supposed to be able to do anything like this. So you have it at both levels. And in the Urfa Museum, you have things like the Urfa Man. Isn't he beautiful? What do you make of something like this? This is the same period as Göbekli Tepe. I like him a lot. He likes me too. This is the same period as Göbekli Tepe. It wasn't actually found at Göbekli Tepe. It was found when they were doing some construction. Some people say it was an underground parking garage. Other people say it was some parking lot or road construction. This was found in Urfa, not the major city, near Göbekli Tepe, which goes back to Abraham, which arguably is a city that's been inhabited for 11,000 years or more. So you find things like this. I just imagine what is under that city if it could be excavated, but you're not going to move 500,000 people to do that. But getting back to Göbekli Tepe, they found all kinds of things like this. This is known as a totem pole, but I'm sure it has some, very profound meaning that I'm working on trying to figure out. And you get these little figures there, little boar-like animals. They look like boars, at least. And aren't they cute? I think they're just so happy. Look, he's smiling at you. He likes to be here. Yeah, and as I was saying, could they carve heads if they wanted to? Well, this is a human with a head. You see that? And this, I think, looks like an animal, but I think this is symbolic of something much richer, much deeper. Okay, something about Göbekli Tepe is that it saw different stages of use and reuse. Something that's very important here. This is ancient. Everything in this picture is ancient. What I mean by that is look at this pillar. Do you see how this pillar got knocked down and was reconstructed? Do people see that? This was knocked down, reconstructed in ancient times. You can see how they sort of did it hastily. This pillar, do you see how there's this crude wall packed against it? This is all over 10,000 years ago, prior to it being buried by 8,000 BC. So something was happening. To make a long story short, I think this suffered catastrophes at the end of the last ice age. They tried to rebuild parts of it hastily. They put in supporting walls, if you would, or secondary walls, and then ultimately ended up covering the whole thing over. It's also a little interesting or misleading even if you start looking at it now and you don't know exactly what you're looking at. For instance, this is in 2010, a picture that we took in 2010. Do you see how you can see that it was re-erected in the ancient wall? What's happened now? So you see all that stones there? They could mislead you to thinking that's ancient. Those are just modern stones, well, ancient stones, old stones that archaeologists piled up. Ostensibly to what? Protect it, but it's also covering evidence of what's going on. Likewise, they've been crating up parts of it, and they crate and uncrate over time. So it's, covering of evidence purposefully or just inadvertently can be a problem. But does everyone see the point that it seems to have been used in different stages? There was a stage of catastrophe, then a stage of later building, which is much cruder. Look at this one, for instance. You see the face peeking out? Okay, that was not carved, I'm absolutely convinced, to just have a crude wall packed against it. That crude wall is later, but still over 10,000 years ago. Look at this one. Do you see what they did with this one? It totally fell down or got knocked down in some catastrophe, and then they quickly put it back into position using parts of it, using other slabs. Everyone see that? So there's weird things going on here. Here's a closer version of it. And then ultimately, they took this whole site and they covered it over, and it was absolutely intentionally buried, as I mentioned, by 8,000 BC. As Klaus Schmidt has both said in, the late Klaus Schmidt said in certain publications and interviews, and to me personally, he was convinced that they spent as much time, different type of work, but as much time and energy burying it, to bury it, and presumably preserve it. Maybe they wanted to come back to it later, as they did to build it initially. I mean, they essentially built an artificial mountain over the structure. And a big question is, why would they do this? So this is end of the last ice age. This drove me to back to a topic I'd been interested in for many years, even before even when I was a graduate student in the 1980s. And this is what is happening at the end of the last ice age. Göbekli Tepe, to make it very clear and blunt, Göbekli Tepe straddles the end of the last ice age. I now believe, and I didn't go into great detail on this aspect of the Sphinx, but the Sphinx itself, the core body, the original Sphinx, I believe goes back to the end of the last ice age. What do I mean by the end of the last ice age? I will give you a very specific number. The ice age ends 9,700 BC. Okay, 9,700 BC is not just, I say circa there. When we're talking circa, geologically, we're talking within a couple of decades, because there are ice cores now, primarily from Greenland. They're correlated sediment cores, and you can see the change, and it happens virtually immediately within, at this point, based on some of the literature, within days of going from the ice age to out of the ice age. Huge temperature changes. So this is very well documented at this point. So you have the end of the last ice age, and it's not a simple phenomenon, what's happening at the end of the last ice age. And this ties back to the ancient sites and what was happening to civilization at that time. So end of the last ice age, it actually started to get warmer. A lot of times people will talk about the last glacial maximum being about 20,000 or so years ago. It started to get slowly warmer. Then there was a cold snap at 10,900 BC, which is known as the beginning of the Younger Dryas. Dryas is a little flower that tends to proliferate under colder conditions. That's why it's called the Younger Dryas, because you get a bunch of the pollen from it. And then there's this final sudden warming in 9,700 BC. To show you graphically, this is a chart from a book I'm an author on. It was cold back in the Ice Age. Everyone agree? Yeah. Yeah, this is, and it started to get warmer, actually pretty quickly, pretty dramatically. Then all of a sudden, so this is 10,900 BC, it gets cold again, really cold. Everyone follow? And then 9,700 BC, it gets dramatically warm. And again, we're talking within years. We're actually probably talking within weeks or days based on the latest data, which just came out. And it gets incredibly warm, and that is the end of the last ice age. Göbekli Tepe straddles, and I believe the Sphinx now straddles this period right in here. So it's very important time period. And how do you explain these major changes? One thing that I hypothesized and other people have talked about, and I talk about this in 2003 in a book called Voyages of the Pyramid Builders. And as I was saying at the beginning of this presentation, I think sometimes we have to be able to change our mind, or we have to look at the evidence and follow it as it goes. I had suggested that maybe a comet, because comets in particular, can they cause cooling periods? So maybe for the initial cooling period, a comet explosion, but it doesn't explain how you get that warming at the end anyway. I suggest that tentatively. Other people have thought about that tentatively. In 2007, there was a paper published. I'll discuss this in more detail tomorrow in my presentation. 2007, there was a paper published that suggested a comet was the initiator of the Younger Dryas. And I thought, initially I thought that was great because I sort of was in line with my thinking. There are major problems, though. Even a comet, as was hypothesized, wouldn't fundamentally change the world. It would just prolong the ice age. And the real question is, how do you snap out of an ice age? How do you get this incredible warming? A comet isn't really going to do that. So there's a lot of problems. There's actually problems with the comet theory too, because this was published last year and there's been more evidence even within the last month. If you have a comet, the indicators of a comet should occur all simultaneously. Everyone follow what I'm saying? A comet hits it once, and within geological parameters, they should all occur chronologically at the same time within a very narrow range. It turns out when you analyze the evidence, very specifically, and this was published in Proceedings of National Academy of Sciences. One of numerous papers have addressed this. It just doesn't work. It fails. The evidence doesn't hold up. There's been a lot of misidentification of evidence, misidentification of dating, that type of thing. It went too fast. I was in good company, though, just as sort of to make myself feel better. Even things like Science News, which is quite reputable, they got it wrong too. Ice Age ends smashingly. Did a comet blow up over eastern Canada? One, it turns out the comet evidence doesn't hold up. Two, they were talking 10,900 BC, which is not the end of the last ice age. It's 1,200 years later. Everyone follow me? Yeah. So you have to really critically analyze everything. So what could cause a cold snap globally? One thing I'm thinking now is a shutdown of the sun. We've been talking about the solar properties in this conference. You've already heard about that, how the sun is affecting things. It turns out that our sun is a typical star. It goes through periods of more activity, less activity. And one thing it does is it can, quote, shut down a little bit. Other times can explode. I want to focus on the end of the last ice age now at 9700 BC. And I believe that what we had was a major solar explosion. I'll talk about this in more detail tomorrow and the evidence for it. But major solar explosion, 9700 BC, which basically decimated these early civilizations of the time. When I say that, who was building the Great Sphinx? Who was carving that? Who was building the temple? Who was involved with Göbekli Tepe? What was the civilization behind this? That Göbekli Tepe was not just an isolated little example, and it straddles this. We see evidence of catastrophe that goes that was occurring then. And I'll talk about this a little more tomorrow. Ice cores, sediment cores, ancient petroglyphs. Do you know what petroglyphs are? Yeah, carvings on rocks. You get, Native American petroglyphs, that type of thing. Not all petroglyphs, but certain ones. The Easter Island script all indicates that there was this major solar activity, this major solar outburst, 9700 BC. I want to mention just very briefly one person that ties in with this. This is Dr. Perrott at Los Alamos National Laboratory in New Mexico, and he is a government physicist. His specialty is plasma physics. He studies things like the sun and stars and solar outbursts, and he independently came to the conclusion. I first met him in 2000. He independently came to the conclusion from really a hobby studying these ancient petroglyphs that they are indicative of what you would see in the sky, basically drawings, these very ancient ones, not all petroglyphs, but these very ancient subset of petroglyphs, what you would see in the sky, plasma electrically charged formations during a major solar outburst from our sun. Do people follow? If you think about the northern and southern lights, do they take weird shapes? Yes, and I don't know if people have ever seen them. Even when we have small coronal mass ejection CMEs, it'll drive them down to lower latitudes. That happened not that long ago in certain parts of the world, and this can affect things. He has found these around the world, he and his colleagues in over 130 countries. They show various diagnostic features that these are depictions of plasma features you would see in the sky during a major solar outburst. Katie, my wife, Catherine Ulysses, and I have been studying the Rongo, this mysterious script from Easter Island, which shows the same features. And as I'll talk about tomorrow, Easter Island goes back much further than the classical archaeologists want to admit. And there's very solid evidence for that now, that once again, I don't hate to say it that way, but do we progress in our knowledge? Yes, we'll put it that way. And could this major solar outburst they really wreaked havoc at the end of the last ice age, and it would have caused great rains and deluges because it would have evaporated icebergs, it would have evaporated glaciers, it would have put a lot of precipitation into the atmosphere that would rain down. And remember the Sphinx? It was huge rains are recorded there. I think this all ties together. One last point I'll make now, in Cappadocia, which is part of Turkey, not far from Göbekli Tepe, there's a long tradition of living where? Underground. This is what you would do if you're protecting yourself from a major solar outburst. The best way, and I've modeled this with astrophysicists I know, is to go underground under so much rock. Here we have an area that to this day they have that tradition. Katie actually came up with this term, SIDA, I like it, solar-induced dark age, that we humanity went into a solar-induced dark age. Pockets of people survived, including one, this is Göbekli Tepe, I'm now talking about Cappadocia right over here, and that they survived by going underground. Independent evidence. I like independent evidence. It has nothing to do with geology in this case. Well, it has something to do with it, but they didn't realize it at the time. Studies of the origin and expansion of the Indo-European language family. Why am I talking about this all of a sudden? It turns out when you map it back, it maps back, can you see the map there? To guess where? If you look at the graph, the oldest, at the end of the last ice age, there seemed to be a pocket of people speaking some language which was the origin of all the languages coming from this region. Isn't that sort of interesting? So I think that that may have been one outpost, if you would, one place people survived and then spread out from there. Earlier civilization, to summarize in a nutshell, earlier cycle of civilization reached very high levels of sophistication in Turkey and Egypt, other places, I'm sure, wiped out at the end of the last ice age by this horrible, would have been a huge catastrophe, solar-induced, solar outburst, and then a dark age, solar-induced dark age, SIDA period, and then it was a re-emergence of civilization in the period 4 to 3000 BC, not the original civilization. So I'll be talking about this more tomorrow, and if for any reason you can't make it tomorrow, but even if you can, we have copies of Forgotten Civilization, my book on sale. This is the ARE is selling it, so we're all set there, so please pick up a copy. And thank you very, very much. It's really great to be here.
And so before you leave, I just want to acknowledge again the tremendous work that Robert is doing.
We were born before the wind, also younger than the sun. Yeah, the bonny boat was one, and we sailed into the mystic. Hark now, hear the sailors cry. Smell the sea and feel the sky. Let your soul and spirit fly into the mystic. When that foghorn blows, I will be coming home. When that foghorn whistle blows, I wanna hear it. I don't have to fear it, and I wanna rock your gypsy soul, just like way back in the day. magnificently we will flow to the mystic. When that foghorn blows, you know I will be coming home. Ooh, when that foghorn whistle blows, I gotta hear it, yeah. I don't have to fear it. Gypsy soul, just like way back in the days of old. And magnificently we will flow into the mystic. Come on, boy.
Take a little time to think things over. I better read between the lines in case I need it when I'm older. Mountain I must climb feels like the world upon my shoulder. But through the clouds I see love shine. It keeps me warm as life grows colder. In my life there's been heartache and pain. I don't know if I can like love has finally found me. In my life there's been heartache and pain. I don't
Spend all your time waiting for that second chance, for a break that would make it okay. There's always some reason to feel not good enough, and it's hard at the end of the day. I need some distraction, oh, beautiful release. Memories seep from my veins. Let me be empty, oh, and weightless, and maybe I'll find some peace tonight in the arms of the angel. Fly away from here, from this dark, cold hotel room, and the endlessness that you fear. You are pulled from the wreckage of your silent reverie. You're in the arms of the angel. May you find some comfort here. So tied up in a straight line, and everywhere you turn, there's vultures and thieves at your back. The storm keeps on twisting. You keep on building the lies that you make up for all that you lack. It don't make no difference. Escape one last time. It's easier to believe in this sweet madness, all this glorious sadness that brings me to my knees. In the arms of the angel, fly away from here, from this dark, cold hotel room, and the endlessness that you fear. You are pulled from the wreckage of your silent reverie. You're in the arms of the angel. May you find some comfort here. You're in the arms of the angel. May you find some comfort here.
Wild grace has its own has its own face, prone to flight. Sky grown, wind blown, wings flown, over air blown, back tonight. Flashing, freely clashing, love of chaos, love of one. Bright storms, rising free forms, wild swans up against the sun. Spirit, none go near it. All men fear it more than night. Some say love goes one way, and then one day no more flight. Well, this year it is not clear just what ends it or what's begun.